Nicolas, Jean, Jacob's Rod, B. A translation from the French of a rare and curious work, A.D. 1693, on the art of finding springs, mines, and minerals by means of the hazel rod. D. Introduction. In bringing this rare and most curious work before your notice, permit me to say that from the earliest times it has been observed that all things in nature act powerfully on those persons called by the Baron von Reichenbach sensitives, especially the metals, causing in them a state of electrical disturbance. This I purpose to teach you how to induce, and by its means find, with almost unerring certainty, mines of metal, minerals, and springs of water, without even the trouble of going to the place where they are situated. At the same time, it is my most earnest request, and I cannot enforce it too strongly, that should you desire to test my discovery for yourself personally, the strictest attention must be paid to the instructions given, as otherwise inevitably bad results to the sensitive will ensue. As regards the translation, perhaps it is too literal. Allow me to observe that, as far as my experience of 20 to 5 years goes, some of the explanations and instructions given in it are incorrect, or, at all events, not warranted by actual proofs. However, I will not review the work of M. Baritel in any carping spirit, in the main he is right, but rather put before you in plain language, and I hope clearly, my own experiments with my wife, who has long been privately known to have the precious gift of not only being able to diagnose diseases with exactitude, and so curing the hopelessly sick, but of finding mines, springs, and sea, by her faculty, some of which are now in actual work. And producing good results to them, however, I may not refer, having received remuneration, but much prefer to give ocular demonstration and, if required, practical instruction. T.W. Jacob's Rod, a translation from the French. Chapter 1, which serves as an introduction to this treatise. The most healthy philosophy allows that the stars influence all sublunary things, and that the quality which is proper and individual to each body, animate or inanimate, depends absolutely, or derives its nature, from that which the star impresses on it, which rules over it even from its generation. Experience convinces us every day of this truth, and teaches us at the same time that the knowledge of the chief part of these different qualities are closed letters for men, that certainly they discover some, but there is only the sovereign being who has a perfect knowledge of them. And when he permits that mortals draw some of them from the darkness in which their ignorance keeps them buried, it is a benefit which proceeds less from their labor and from their experience than from a particular favor which his divine goodness grants to their indigence and to the relief of their misery. Man, as well as other bodies, and as the most noble participates in these influences, one lives but for war, another for study, and cannot satisfy his curiosity. One seems born for commerce, another to teach, or be. For agriculture, one loves law and has the spirit of business, the other abhors them and flies them as contrary to his repose and tranquility. In fine, one is born a poet, another becomes an orator, and to speak. With the Apostle Paul to the Ephesians, Ch. 4:5-2, he gave some apostles, N.C. It is constantly that all these different inclinations of men proceed and are only impressed on them at the moment of their birth by the different conjunctions, or by the different aspects of the planets with the signs, and the other stars which rule or influence. They are as secondary causes of which God makes use to shed his different gifts upon men, and if by his grace each for himself was happy enough to know the inclination of the star which influences over him, principally, he would succeed without difficulty in applying himself to the occupations belonging to it, or would in some degree correct the malignity of it if he were careful to avoid the occasions where it would cause him to sin. It is not my design to enlarge here upon the proof of this proposition, nor to show how and which are the stars which produce these different effects. Besides, this matter being too lofty for me, it would deserve a more ample volume. Besides being quite out of my subject, my only object is to treat of those to whom God, by the influence of the stars, has impressed the faculty of discovering, by the movement of the rod called Jacob's Rod, all hidden things, subterranean and others. They maintain that those who have this virtue, or faculty, are born under the planet Mercury or Saturn, and under the signs Aquarius and Taurus. We find many who have a similar ascendant either in all or in part, but I can say there are very few who have a true knowledge of their influence, or who know how to make use of it. It is a hidden treasure. It is a dead power in them, which is entirely useless to them. I will reanimate it in telling them of some experiences which I have or will make on this subject, and in showing them the use of the rod, I will make them bring into action a virtue which they possessed only as a power. I will also teach those who have not this virtue the means not to be deceived by so many adventurers or others who falsely pretend to have it. In fact, everyone knows the beauty and the utility of water in a domain, the riches produced by the discovery of mines and of hidden metals, the tranquility and repose given to families by discovering the limits which separate their lands, the place where they ought to be, when by the fraud of the proprietors or by the succession of the times they are changed. In a word, no one ignores the pleasure of discovering many hidden things about which one is often much troubled, but few people know the way to find them, the place, its depth, its width, the different kinds, the quantity contained, and, in a word, the secret not to make a mistake whilst making the search, and to avoid the great and useless expenses often incurred. This is what I wish to teach now. The present which I make to the public is as rare as it is new, and I flatter myself that, hitherto, no one has contemplated making a similar one. This thought makes me hope. B. 2. That they will heartily receive a liberality, which another doubtless will enrich with a reasoning more solid and better sustained, but not with a more certain experience, and greater frankness than I give it. I agree that I cannot give it to all equally, because according as the planet or the sign that rules is in the ascendant or descendant, apogee, perigee, or as they concur alone, or join with other stars of different quality, there are some who have the faculty of discovering generally all sorts of hidden things, others in whom this faculty is very weak, or limited to discover only certain things. For example, some discover only water, others only mines, others one sort of metal, some only boundaries, in fine, some to whom the rod turns in rising against the stomach, and others to whom it turns in descending to the earth. But, however it may be, after making the experiments, each will take it after his own way, and all we need observe is that afterwards, in speaking of him who holds the rod, one must always understand that the experiments spoken of ought to be made by one having this faculty entire or in part, and that by the terms rod, forked stick, and sea, we understand only one and the same thing. Chapter 2. Of the quality of the rod. There are many who think that the particular talent of a man does not suffice for the discovery of hidden things, that he must have, besides a specific instrument formed by nature, or destined for this use. It is why they would choose a certain wood to the exclusion of another, and for this reason they say the green is preferable to the dry, and, amongst the green, that which has the most pith and the most sap has the most effect, for they say its humidity, being of the nature of springs, has more inclination to find its like. Hence why they say that the hazel, which has never borne fruit, the whitethorn, the wild plum, the willow, and other similar ones, are absolutely necessary for such an operation. But this is an error which can be proved by reason and experience, for the reason, too, that if it were so one must believe that which is not, that the faculty, power is in the wood alone, that these kinds would produce the same effect to all generally, without distinction of the ascendant, and, in fine, that the kinds of woods growing in the most moist places, or in places containing mines, would be more suited than others to this purpose, because having their roots in the water, by touching with their extremities mines upon which they are grown and have been nourished, they would have been able to retain from them some quality or rapport which would give them a natural inflection to their center as to their common country. This error is proved also by experience, which teaches us that all sorts of wood of every kind have an equally rapid and violent movement, and that it is indifferent whether it be green or dry, whether it has been cut by him who uses it or by another, whether it is pithy or not. And though the green wood ought to prevail over the dry, because being full of sap, and the pores more open, transpiration should be more prompt, nevertheless it seems that if one ought to choose the dry, would be preferable to the green, because, wanting moisture, it would be more inclined to search for it, and to bend or turn for that purpose in those places where it is. But as we have said, this choice is useless, because they all serve equally, and that if one need make ore, it is rather for convenience than necessity. I mean that in use the softest and least rough are more convenient than the cheese, though they are much of greater effect, whence I dime this conclusion that this virer or power is not attached to the wood, nor to the instrument one tice, but rather to the efficiency of blood of him who uses it. It is the load which causes the wood to turn by dhelodression. It communicates to it at the moment the mix takes it with his two hands, so that this instrument, whatever its quality, is only a signal of which the man Pincus used to indicate to him the movement of his blood upon what there is hidden. A mark of this oath is that the dry wood of whatever nature it may be, earns as easily as the green, and not only the wood, but also iron, silver, brass, wire, whaling, and other supple and solid matters, excepting in the cases which we will name afterward. Chapter 111. On the form of the rod, Holy Scripture teaches us that the patriarch Jacob placed some striped tods in the fountains where he watered the cattle of his father-in-law, Laban. so that the impression he had given them in striping them should communicate itself to die animals while ing, and from them to the little ones to which they would give birth, which has given rise to some to call by the name of Jacob's rod all those they used for the purpose of giving or receiving some impression. And as the forked stick receives a considerable one, it has acquired the preceding title, it has also received the name of the patriarch. There are others who, seduced by the similarity of the effect of this rod with that of Moses, give it the same name, not only because this is susceptible of impression from alf kind of matters, as that of Moses was in all the forms he wished to give to it, but also because they say that the miracle that Moses produced in causing water to flow from the rock of Horeb is in some niamte reproduced in using this one, by the facility it gives in finding springs in the bosom of the earth or in the hollow of the rocks. But without insisting on these etymologies, which have more of the brilliant than of the solid, since Treatise has fixed it, and that is one serves not only for the discovery of water, but also of all hidden things, we will leave it the name of Jacob's rod, and us that which the patriarch used was only a stick, such as is generally carried in the land. Many have desired that the one used in the discovery of hidden things should be of that foreign. It seemed that their opinion is not without foundation, and only because it is serian dat every kind of red, as well every other sapple and solid thing which one carries, turns in the hand. Of him who is born under the planet of which we have spoken, at the moment in which lie passes over some spring or mine or hidden thung, that also because in utter to ascertain if it peacenally has this faculty we make him hold his hand open with a stick, similar to the one we have just spoken of, upon the palm of his open hand, and, in the event of its turning or shewing movement in passing over the thing sought for, one concludes that he has this faculty or more, and that the experiment is without fraud, and that is represented in the figure D. Experience has taught that the simple movement of the rod is not enough to indicate positively the place where the thing is hidden. One has introduced the use of the forked stick made in this form, somewhat like the letter Y, possibly, because its movement is more rapid and perceptible, or possibly because in turning in the hand, it indicates and marks with the point the place where the hidden thing is, so that it appears as though all the virtue of this indication is enclosed in this point, and that the impression which the stick receives from the two hands which hold it on both sides transfers itself to this extremity in order to show us what we seek for, from which we draw this certain conclusion, that it is exactly in the place, and opposite to the place where this point lowers itself, that we must dig to find what we seek. I prove this truth not only by natural reason, which teaches us that united forces have more power, and that the impression which the stick receives by its two extremities, communicating and uniting at the end, gives more force to the indication, as being more abundant and vigorous, but also by the experience. Inasmuch that if one hides water or metals in two different places, at about a foot's distance from each other, or from that, of the extremities of the stick, when the point shall be placed over the one or the other, it will infallibly descend, and if carried into the middle, the two hands being above each to the opposite, it will not descend at all, which clearly justifies the inference we have drawn, that this point serves to mark more justly and certainly the place of the concealed thing. The form of which we have just spoken is also more useful than the simple rod, because one must sometimes dig and search in the clefts of the rocks where mines are, upon the edge of steep places where boundaries may be found, and in other places where space is so limited that the saddleness of the place would impede the free movement of the rod, and one would not be able to find the thing sought for were it not indicated by the end of the forked stick, which being only 1 foot, longer or less, can easily be carried everywhere. There is still a reason which inclines us to say that this stick ought to be. It is that if in a same space, or in a small distance, there are many things of different natures hidden, as the stick would give equal movement for all, one would never be able to distinguish of the kinds, as we will presently shew, if the smallness of the stick does not leave us a space to pass from the place of the one to that of the other, in order to observe the different causes of its movement. Chapter 4. Of the manner of holding Jacob's rod and how it turns. Ayar is indifferent how one holds the rod, and each person, according to the power of his ascendant, by his prudence and by use, may take a particular posture, as may be most convenient and useful, to make his discovery. However, as those who have not yet practiced may be embarrassed by ignorance of its use, they will here learn that there are 3 ways the most usual and frequent to hold it. The first is to hold it straight, the point uppermost and the backs of the 2 points closed, against the ground, in this way marked by the figure A. The second way is to hold it flat, lying down, the point in front and the backs of the 2 points which close it turned against the body, thus as represented in the figure B. And the third in a posture which is the middle between these two, by which one holds the point neither entirely up nor entirely in front, but between, as the figure C represents. When one holds it in the first way, in turning it springs up generally against the stomach. When held in the second way, in turning it generally descends towards the ground. And when held in the third way, it turns indifferently, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other. It often does the same in the two first, but from the want of certainty which occurs then, in one and the other, we will draw a certain rule, in order to know the width of the hidden things, their depth, the perception of springs, of minds, and the boundaries of other matters. As over the width its movement is always uniform, that is to say, that those to whom it turns with a downward movement find a similar movement as long as they walk over the space of the width, and when whilst still walking its movement begins to change, that is, when instead of turning downwards it rises towards the stomach, they know that they enter on the space of the depth. They know, likewise, that they are following the length of a spring, of a mine, or of a limit. When after Linving seen the movement of lowering over the width, the contrary over the depth, it gives a similar one for the length. That is also in rising against the stomach. Although the third manner of holding the rod does not appear of great utility, because the switch, as we have said, touring indifferently, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other, it appears as if one cannot so well distinguish the space of the depth of the hidden thing. It is, however, its conveniences, because being either too macmized nor too much lowered, its movement is more prompt and more perceptible when it rises against the stomach or when it lowers towards the ground, because having only a quarter of a tarn to make in order to rise or fall, it is consequently more easy for it to bend on one side or the other, so that each way of holding the stick has its conveniences, to use either with success. After having tried them all, it is well to make to oneself a rule to hold it moderately and always evenly used, so that one can judge in this equality of the more or of the less of the violence of its movement. Otherwise, its movement will never be so perceptible. Since in one case the violence one does oneself in tightening it too, prevents part of the discernment and sensibility, on the other hand, in not sufficiently tightening the hold. The impression is not so strong, and the movement cannot be so perceptible. Besides this, it is necessary to walk slowly in making this research, for fear the too great activity, or the too large steps, should cause us to perceive the movement only after having passed the place which caused it, and, in losing the place where we ought to dig, we lose by our quickness what we seek with so much care. The form and the different ways of holding the rod make us see the little foundation of those who pretend that it turns in proportion as one places the foot over the hidden thing, inasmuch as it is not only the passing of the body over the thing which gives the movement to the rod, but also that of the rod. This truth can easily be proved in stretching forward the arms of the stick only over the hidden thing, and it will be seen that the point will descend or ascend before one or both feet are placed there. What confirms what we have advanced is that the virtue, power, is attached rather to the hands which hold the rod, and which communicate the movement of the blood, than to the other parts of the body which do not touch it. Thus, when one says ordinarily that the rod turns in proportion as one puts the foot over the hidden thing, it is an expression which figuratively expresses a part for the whole, or one part for the other. Before finishing this chapter, I ought to explain the causes of the different movements of the rod, as well upon the length as the width and the depth, but after putting the first in the 6th chapter before. Finishing this, I will observe that the difference of the movement upon the width and upon the depth is founded upon a natural reason, though in the effect it does not appear extraordinary, inasmuch as the movement which the rod gives, either above or below, proceeding only as we shall establish presently from subtle bodies of the nature of the hidden thing, which occupying perpendicularly in the air all its space, attract and cause to bend, by the impression which they give to the blood, the stick towards the place which encloses it as if to indicate it to him. It is not extraordinary that the stick takes a different movement when it leaves the space, because the subtle bodies which it draws with it in leaving it and trying to return to their center, and being drawn there by the others, or by their natural inclination, cause IR to make a circular movement backwards like their own, and consequently different from that they made when they occupied the space. The demonstration of this reason is found in going up or down the course of a spring, because these subtle bodies, being agitated otherwise than they are in crossing it, cause a different movement in the rod. Chapter 5. How one may know, in general, how to distinguish hidden things by Jacob's rod. Those who seek hidden things often find only as a recompense for their labor and the excessive expense they have made in order to dig, only a piece of stone, of iron, or some metal, instead of the spring they were seeking. And, on the contrary, when wishing for a metal they find nothing, or a spring so abundant that it would rather inundate than water. This error arises from not knowing the nature of the hidden things, and from not knowing before digging if they are of the quality sought for. It seems at first that this knowledge is impossible, and that unless the earth were of crystal, or that there were a window to look into it, such as an ancient wished in the heart of man, what the former contains is as hidden as the thoughts of the latter are impenetrable. However, experience daily teaches us the contrary, and shows us at the same time that this knowledge is infallible, by observing the things that follow. To be persuaded of it, one must allow two principles, equally incontestable, which will serve as a basis for all discoveries, and as a foundation for all which we shall say. The first, that the rod turns over any hidden thing, of whatever nature it may be, source, mine, male, mineral, limit, and other things of the kind. The second, that apparent things of the same nature take away the movement the one from the other. When seeking them, for example, water, metals, and hidden things give no movement to those of the same nature that ate. Apparent. In a word, the visible thing of the same nature as the hidden one takes away and stops the movement which the rod bade over the hidden one. I will give under a separate head the reason of these two principles, and in this one shall prove them by experience. It is certain the rod never turns without a cause, and if in carrying it we find some movement, although we do not at first know the exact material, we ought to conclude that there is a hidden thing in the place where the movement was found. And, as the difficulty is to know if it is for water, for a metal, for a limit, or some other hidden thing, we can distinguish and know its nature by applying successively at the end of the rod many different kinds, as gold, silver, copper, lead, a linen or a paper wetted the size of an inch, and C, until we have found the one which stops this movement. Then, by the principle which we have established on the subject, you must hold it as certain that the hidden thing is of the same nature as that which is at the end of the rod, and that the effect ceases by the same cause which produces it. This principle is certain when there is only a single thing hidden capable of producing this movement. But if there are many different ones which cause this movement, we remain always in the same uncertainty, because one kind only does not stop it, when there are others hidden which have the power of moving the rod. For example, a spring flowing in a mine, or in a leaden or brass pipe, will cause the rod to turn, but the mine, lead, copper, or tin in the pipe will do so also, so that the power of the one kind will not stop the movement, whilst there are others which can't it. When, then, we have placed a wet linen rag at the end of the rod, it will not cease turning, for the lead, copper, solder, or the single pipe, when the spring no longer flows. Therefore, we can only discover all these different kinds except by our putting at the end of the rod or in the hollow of the hand, in such a way as that it shall touch them, as many different kinds as may be hidden, such as lead, tin, copper, and C, because then it will stop, and will have no more movement for the reasons we shall name after. It may also occur that at the place of a spring, we may have made a limit, or hidden a treasure. This treasure may be enclosed in a casket, ornamented with nails of iron or of silver, closed with a steel lock, or may be in an earthen vessel, or one of tin, of cast iron, or of metal. It is sure the rod will turn for all these kinds, and that we cannot stop its movement unless by making it touch all at the same time. Which brings me on to say that in order to enlighten oneself truly, we must at first make these experiments for all the kinds individually, and where it is seen that there is not one that stops the rod, touch it with several at once, until its movement is stopped by the influence of all those which are hidden. After seeing the kinds that have stopped it, we ought to conclude, as a natural inference, that there are as many hidden as there were that touched it at the same time. When we have recognized the kind buried, still we do not know its quantity, nor its true quality. If it is a spring or stagnani water, a gold coin or a mine of that metal, a mine or a har of iron, a mine or a copper coin, and C, and it is not incompatible that all these things, or a good part of them, may be found nearly at the same place. In order to know it, it is only necessary to follow the movement of the rod, whilst ascending and descending, after going over the place cross, wise, where the movement was felt. If it is a spring, you thus discover the place from whence it springs, and whither it flows, which we could not find in a pond. By this means we distinguish also the piece of metal from the mine, because this last, having veins or threads, we follow the vein going up and descending, which we cannot do in a piece of metal, bar of iron, or vessel of cast iron, and C, which, having only a limited space, cause the red to turn in this space, which is never of such an extent as the spring or mine. The way to follow the spring or mine is not difficult, by remarking what we have said in the preceding chapter, that the rod always turns in the same way when one crosses over them, and that it turns differently in returning, or when you go the least from the track. This manner of recognizing the mine, or the springs, serves also to distinguish them from other hidden things, for on one side, that over all the rest the rod turns equally, over their length and over their width, and on the other it shows us the difference of the spring which generally only goes on serpentinely, from the limit which goes always straight, and from that which is neither mine nor spring, from that which is by the little limited space which encloses the first. And though there may be other things almost as extended as the mine, and the subterranean water, as, for example, a source conducted by pipes of lead or other metal, they can also as easily be distinguished by the solderings of the pipes, as by other influences which they have, inasmuch as we cannot stop the movement of the rod upon these solderings or on the other alloys, except by making it touch tin or metals of the same nature as the alloys, which is absolutely useless. When there is only one source or one mine, we can also in the same way distinguish the place where the source loses itself, from that where it is still in the pipe, as water, tin, and lead would be necessary in order to stop it in the place where the pipe is enclosed, and the lead and tin suffice for that where it c no longer runs, which is a great help when one wishes to give up a spring, to avoid digging, and to discover, without need, other places than that where it fails. All these things are certain and easy to prove. It is only necessary to hide the things over which one desires to experiment, and the truth of what I have advanced will be found, but we must be careful of two things. The first, that he who makes the search does not deprive himself of the power of making the discovery, which may happen to him. If, by example, he have silver buckles, or nails in his shoes, gold rings in C, or other metals concealed in his clothes, so that the rod would turn to him as easily for what he wore as for the other things hidden. The second, that the rod must not be of the same nature as the hidden thing, that is to say, of gold, silver, or brass wire, or whalebone, to seek for things of this nature, as it is evident that it would not come, for the same kinds of which it is composed, and this is the case that I have accepted in the second chapter, where I said it turned of whatever material it might be. This also determined me that it is more sure and of greater wility to use one of wood, because the movement of that can never be stopped by another of the same quality. Having removed all that can oppose itself to our intention, he who makes the trial must know two things. The first, that the rod will turn infallibly over the hidden things. The second, that it will stop by the application of a similar matter to the hidden thing. Chapter 6. How to discover in particular mines and hidden metals. Though in the preceding chapter we have shown in general the manner of discovering hidden things, and though it seems that what we have said of it ought to give a perfect idea of what to do, still, as there are many particular observations in each kind, which can only be known by long experience, I have thought it necessary to make a special chapter upon what ought to be noticed whilst making the search for metals, mines, and minerals. Those who search for metals would not wish to find water, on the contrary, as it might deceive them in causing the rod to tum, the same as the metal which may be above or under, and nie cause them an excessive expense to exhaust it from the nine when it is found with it. They would prefer that there should not be any at all. To extricate one from this embarrassment, one tries before everything to ascertain if there is any spring in the place where the rod turns, and in order to discover it at the time of the search, one has the precaution of putting a wet rag at the end of the rod, and when one sees that this linen does not stop this movement, one knows at once, either that there is no water, or that if there is, it is joined with some other master that continues this movement. As this matter can only be a metal, a mineral, and C, after having touched it with C2, several metals or minerals, and C, without their stopping, one draws again this conclusion, that there are no metals or minerals, and C, in these places, or that with them there are also other kinds which continue this movement, such as a dead body, a boundary, and C. For a dead body one must touch it with some rotten, or for limits we will treat of putrefied animal matter, them in another chapter. It is then a certain rule that for the search for metals, one must have the precaution, above all things, first, of a wet linen at the end of the rod, and to furnish oneself with as many different kinds of metals or minerals as one thinks may be contained, and as the virtue of stopping is not affixed to the quantity, but to the quality, one easily judges that the pieces are not likely to be very large, and that it suffices that they are of the weight of a crown of gold. Third, one should split each rod with 2 or 3 clefts, or more, so that one can put in the clefts the kind with which one desires to touch it, but for fear that in maying these clefts across, the 2 branches do separate, you must make them on the side of the branches, and in case one cannot put in all the kinds in the clefts one has made, you can place the rest in the hollow of the hand which touches the rod. It is also held as a rule that the kinds do not oppose catch other, and that when, for example, instead of 3 kinds that are hidden, one would touch the rod with 6, either at the end or in the hand, it is certain that the 3 superfluous ones will not prevent its movement, as the defect of one of the 3 could continue it. All that this abundance can produce is confusion and embarrassment. To know which of the 6 are not there, to extricate ain self, one must try as often separately, and conjointly, that one may find at last the only 3 which stop it, and at the same time one knows the superfluous ones. It is also important to remark that if the kinds of which one makes use to stop are not entirely of the same quality as the hidden ones, they will not stop, whence it follows that neither fine gold nor silver will stop for false, inferior, nor the false for the fine common, tin for fine, nor iron for steel. That is indeed very important in this case, when there are 2 kinds of hidden things in 2 different places, in order to know in which place is the false, and in which is the real or fine. It appears surprising that steel, which is only a refined iron, does not stop the movement of faux iron, but the surprise ceases when one remarks that this refinement gives it a different quality by the alloy which enters into its composition, the same as with the alloy of gold and of silver. as open mine is a kind of exception to this rule, as new, as in the state that it issues from the bosom of the earth, it stops the movement for iron, and iron does so for it. Al Hoff, that seems to imply because other bodies with which it is still enveloped by being cleansed ought to give it a carry different. From iron, nevertheless, they produce respectively the same effects. The reason of it is without doubt that the iron saying me ti aniurid does not change its nature by being freed from the heterogeneous substances which enveloped it, like sti, which by its alloy makes a composite of a different nature. In a word, the iron, enveloped by the thick matters of the mine which contains it, can arrest the movement on itself, the same as it can upon the mine. But steel ceasing to be iron, by the alloy of which it is composed, the one can no longer arrest the movement of the other. One can extend the consequence of the mine of iron to others of different quality. For example, a piece of silver mine will stop the movement for silver, and silver for the mine, and C, and the same as that steel does not stop the movement for iron. The composition of this metal will not stop the movement for the mine, or the mine for the composition. The same as one may know it by the trial upon fine or inferior silver. There is still a very curious and necessary observation in the search for mines. It is that there is one part O which is so abundant in sulfur and antimony that they dominate over the metal with which they are mixed. There are other finer ones where the metal dominates over the sulfur and the antimony. In the first kind, it might happen that the metal alone could not stop the movement over the mine, because being, as it were, enveloped in a great abundance of sulfur and antimony, the rod would not turn for the enedle alone. Therefore, one must be provided with a little sulfur and antimony in order to stop its movement. In the second, the metal alone suffices to stop it, which enables us to judge of the fineness, purity of the mine, because the quantity of the metal exceeds that of the antimony. Doubt S. It will not be useless to give in this chapter a means of distinguishing springs and mines from other hidden things, of which we have spoken in the preceding chapter. I mean that one may know one is over a spring or mine when, in crossing over it, the rod turns and lowers, and that in rising up again, it turns towards the stomach, when one follows the length, which does not happen when there is only one separate metal in the mine, or some other thing enclosed in a limited space, inasmuch as then its movement is always uniform in the length and in the width, and it does not change at all, unless one goes out of the space this thing occupies. Here is the reason of this difference. The veins and threads of the mines, being affixed to the trunk like the branches are to the tree, there emanate continually vegetable spirits, which concur in its length to the perfection and to the nourishment of all the parts of this tree. When the man mounts over the space of one of these veins, the subtle parts which emanate from him are drawn by these spirits, and by the shock which they receive from it they are obliged to return to him, and though the man does not feel the movement from it, the rod which receives the impression that these same subtle paras cause him is obliged to follow their inclination, and to retura behind like them. One finds the demonstration of this truth in a body which ascends a running stream, inasmuch as where it is drawn by its movement, or if it has strength to resist it, it makes in the particles of this element a circular movement around it, which give the same impression to mobile thing as are attached to it. But it is not the same with metals separated from the mine, because being in their perfection and separated from the matrix or from the source from which they derive their nourishment, this concourse or this transport of vegetable spirits is no longer made towards them. It is only the particles or subtle bodies which exhale from themselves that cause the movement of the rod. These subtle bodies expel equally in all the space which the metals occupy, and produce consequently only an equal movement in the length and in the width. One ought therefore to hold the maxims of which we have just spoken as constant, a nihil. And it often happens that by wars and by the lapsio time, by the overturning of edifices, and by inundations, many metals are found enclosed in the bosom of the earth. There will be no difficulty in distinguishing. Then, in the future, if one follows the precepts which we have given, and if in the old and dilapidated or other places believed to enclose something, wet linen, does not stop the movement of the rod, one must search in form of a cross over the places where it turns, in order to discover if the movement is different in the width and in the length, and when it is proved to be uniform everywhere, one may boldly conclude that this movement is caused neither by a spring or by a mine, that it must be a metal or some other thing, and afterwards make the different wheels of the metals until you have discovered those that are hidden. Example: if there are arms, the rod will turn equally in the length and in the width of the space which they occupy. But you must not believe that the iron alone stops its movement, as there is steel, others that are ornamented with silver or other metals. To stop the movement, you must touch with these 4 metals, and when it stops, one can in some measure know their quality, in the same way as one knows their depth in the earth, by what we shall say presently. It often happens that after having observed all these rails, put the wet rag at the bottom of the rod, and touched it with all these metals in detail, and together its movement still does not stop, so that one finds oneself in the same doubt, difficulty, as before making the trial. This is the true cause of it. It is that the rod turns also for coal and for all other minerals, such as mercury, sulfur, antimony, ochre, and their composites in which they dominate as gypsum, red chalk, not the black, in which there is no cinnabar, and also others. So that if the metals do not suffice to stop the movement, we must again try these minerals and their compositions in any way one can think of, until we have found the one which was wanted to stop the movement. We may then recommence the trial by taking away one of the kinds which touched besides the last which stopped it, and the rod remaining without movement, we may conclude that there is none of that, and so on. Consecutively, and when in taking away someone, it is seen to begin to move, you may be sure that there is a similar one hid, and so on successively, until you have taken away all those which do not stop its movement. Chapter 7. By what means one may know the width of the hidden springs and mines. I have already stated that the rod turns in descending towards the earth every time one crosses the source, or mine, and that when one ascends them, and passed across the space which they occupy, it turns in mounting towards the stomach. This rule will suffice to make us know at first the width of both, but as the knowledge of the width is an indispensable necessity, whether because the large source or mine gives more hope of their abundance, or because one may deceive oneself, because there are mines and sources which, according to the disposition of the land which encloses them, are larger and more abundant in certain pieces than in others, and which extend where there are branches according as it is sandy, or mixed with stone, or by the point of a rock. We have been unable to avoid making a separate chapter upon what is necessary to be observed on this point. The first thing one must observe to well find the width is to hold the rod in the second and third ways, of which we have spoken in the fourth chapter, that is to say, kosher, lying, or half, lying. Whether because in lowering itself easily in this posture, it better follows the inclination, whether also because by holding it straight when it would lower, it might turn against the stomach the same as over the length of the source, and thus one might deceive oneself if one did not hold it in one of these two ways which we have named. There is a second observation to make in order to distinguish the source which passes in the sand or gravel from the other kinds mentioned. It is that one must carefully examine it the rod FOCs equally upon all the width, or if there are places where it forces less than in others. In the last case, K is a mark or sign that a part of the source is lost in the gravel or in the sand, and in the first that it is in the rock or in fuller's earth, which does not permit it to extend itself, which helps much to prevent useless and excessive expense in following, digging, for sources which may be judged from the depth and the aspect of the place to be in the rock. Having observed what is above, you may make the trial upon a bridge. It will be seen that he who passes, walking slowly, and holding the rod in the mammer came above, improper dayan as he enters, and that he finds himself perpendicularly opposite to the first stone of the arch which touches the water, his rod will begin to turn in lowering its point towards the ground, and will turn always the same until he is at the end of the bridge, perpendicularly opposite to the first stone, which touches the water on the other side of the arch. The movement will be different in the rod, and will turn in ascending towards the stomach as if it wished to return or reunite itself to what it had just left. One may also make the same tried upon a source conducted through pipes of which one knows the thickness and width. I will be seen that the water which is in these pipes is only at the most 3 or 4 inches of width, and that the rod will only or lower its point upon cressing for about this space of 3 or 4 inches, and if one has not the convenience of a spring in order to make the trial, water may be put into a tub, cover it with a board, and bury it a foot deep, or the depth desired, and, after passing over it with the rod, you will see the same effect as over a bridge, or over a source conducted by pines. The same trial may be used for metals, and you must only put in the tub a sufficient quantity of them as to cover the bottom. Then you will find that the rod will lover over all the space occupied by these etals, after which one may boldly draw this conclusion, that the width of mines and of minerals is to be found, in the same way as that of springs. The experience, which we have just given of the bridge or of the fountain conducted by pipes, may also serve to teach us to know when we are over the length of springs and mines, inasmuch that after having seen the point of the rod turn in lowering over the width, if we mount the spring of the course of a river, we see the rod tuning in remounting against the stomach, which tells us we are over the length by the reasons given in the preceding chapter. Before finishing this 110, to make Sony reflections which will indicate to us better the necessity of bringing oneself to well know the width. The first is that there are sources which may be entirely upon the limit of 2 depths, bottoms, and which will follow them even a wall-ever running distance, half over one, half over the other. That may happen even in places when one has no longer the desire to find them, as it is not permitted to dig on our neighbor's land. Knowing that a part of the width is in ours, we may dig there boldly, and draw there by the opening we make, or by the slant we give, not only the half of the water, but the entire source. The second concerns those to whom the rod turas in proportion as they approach the place which contains the mine or spring, inasmuch as if by a long experience they do not accustom themselves to distinguish the place of his approach of the space they occupy, they would often take the change, and dig in the first instead of the last for sturces or metals which they expect to find. They would only have the confusion of having lost their trouble by digging in vain. In order to avoid this, one must consider first that in the approach the rod turns almost on all things in an equal distance, and the same on every side across. If by example with sources or hidden things that are known to us, we remark chat in approaching them, it turns for 2 or 3 feet on each side. We can judge by this distance of that of the things which are not known to us. Secondly, that the rod never forces as inch in the approach as over the width. There are some, even, who feel only a very little movement from it. On approaching it thus, it is not difficult to them to distinguish the place where it does not force from that where it does force. Thirdly, we must measure on each side of the mine, or of the source, the distance which is usual to us for the movement of the approach, and after taking the middle, which will be joabless in the space of the width, and that where the rod joins the most, forish, in order to assure oneself if this space is that of the width. One must know that when one ascends or descends a mine or spring, the rod only gives a movement over the true space which they occupy. Thus one has only to remount the space which one has marked, and if the rod continues the movement, it is a sure sign one is over the width, and that it is from this place that one ought to seek the depth, as we shall say afterwards. The third reflection is for those to whom the rod ordinarily turns in ascending against the stomach, so that if the movement, which is imperfect and irregular, does not appear sufficient to Theon to indicate the width, there are still means by which they may assure themselves of it, like those of which the movement is irregular. The first is to assure themselves, as above, by the 2 sides of the source or the mine, of the places where the rod forces them least, and to mark with pegs those where the movement begins to be more mpe, and the distance between these 2 pegs will be that of the width, and if there is none, because that on each side the rapidity of the movement only heggens in the same place, or in the place where one has put the first peg, it is a sure sign that the source or mine is very small, or that they are enclosed in this place, since they occupy so little space. The second is that where the width is found near the first peg, or between the 2, to make sure of it, ascend again the mine or source as above, and if the rod gives movement, it is a proof by the rule we have applied to it. That one is over the true width, and thus, in ascending the mine or spring, one has only to go out on each side of the space made by the width, and mark there with a peg each extremity where the movement ceased, and the distance of these pegs will again be that of the width. It is a mark the more convincing. If this distance is found to be equal to that of the first 2 pegs, pat down. I do not doubt one may have difficulty to know why the rod gives a movement after having crossed the width in a straight line, and why it gives none when one leaves it obliquely, in going up or going down. But this difficulty will cease if you consider that in the first case, the man who walks in from draws with him certain subtle particles of the source or mine, which wanting to reunite themselves to those which they have left, continue the movement of the rod by the effort which they make in returning. Thus it will be more particularly observed in some other place, but in the second, as the man leaves the side, these particles, instead of following him at the moment when he is at the extremity of this width, disperse or glide on and follow the natural inclination of the others. This truth is clearly demonstrated by those who with a bat rod cross the flames in a straight line, the flat part of the rod being hosema, by which process the rod is enabled to draw with itself some of the flames for a little space, but on the contrary, if one were to cross the flames with the rod, the flat part being vertical, none or very little of the particles of the flames would be so drawn. The last reflection we have to make is concerning those to whom the rod only gives movement over certain kinds, and not over all, as they will then make the trials of which we have spoken above. If they do not find what they expected to find, they will feel discouraged, and will believe them defective, or that their move meant is not sufficient to make discoveries, but that ought not to discourage them. On the contrary, I advise them to assure themselves by many trials of things to which their movement answers, and having found them, to keep only to the discovery of the kinds which are peculiar to them. And amongst those who have this faculty in its perfection, there are almost as many different kinds of movement as of temperaments among men. To know the difference of their own from that of others, they should try as much as they can with their friends, to whom the rod also gives movement, and by these different trials they will know certainly for which they are fit, and will form for themselves a routine, or a certain habit to use, so as usefully to employ their Chapter 8. By what means one may know the depth of sources or metals. Tuck's knowledge of the width of springs or mines is useless without that of their depth. This last is even of more importance. Without it, one cannot calculate one's expense with the benefit one expects to receive from the thing whose discovery one desires to make. If the metal is too deep, or in rocks difficult of access, the trouble or the expense may exceed the profit one may receive from its possession. If the spring is not in an elevation proportioned to the incline that we desire, its discovery is more hurtful than profitable to us. We must then necessarily try as much as we can to discover exactly the distance from the depth, and as the preceding chapters have only given us a confused idea of the way to set about it, that is, the discovery of springs, mines, and sea, this one will teach the rules that we must use, and the necessary experiences, to enlighten N. The first is that when we have found the width of a source or of a mine, and that one, know, by the contrary movement that the rod begins, to give in ascending towards the stomach, that we are at its extremity, we should mark with a peg the place where this contrary movement began to be felt, and afterwards walk slowly from this peg until we have again remarked that this movement has ceased, or begins to cease. Then mark this place by a second peg, and afterwards one has only to measure from this last to the first, and the depth will be found in the distance which separates them. I mean to say that there will be as many inches, feet, or yards from the surface of the earth to the place which encloses the hidden thing as there will be from one peg to another. Second thing necessary to clearly find the depth is to try to assure oneself by some sign that the trial we have just made is not defective. The first is to seek for it on the other side of the width, and to plant there two pegs in the same way in order to see if the distances are equal, which is a true mark of the depth. The second is that we should stop a little in the place where the rod remains motionless, to assure oneself that it has no further movement, and then advance a step or two, and if the rod begins to turn downwards, as over the width, this contrary movement marks infallibly that the place we have just left is that of its depth. The third is that after having advanced 7 or 8 steps beyond the second peg, we ought to retrace our steps to the first peg planted, and if the space marked is the true width, the rod will remain always motionless until, beginning to pass beyond the first peg planted, we shall enter into the width. I do not doubt that these signs will surprise many people, but besides the reason of it, which we shall give in another chapter, we may be assured of it by the experience which we have related about it on the bridge, and of a source conducted by pipes. We shall see that as long as we walk upon the bridge holding the rod, in the second or third manner, it will turn towards the earth as we have said, but at the moment we begin to leave the bridge, it will turn ascending towards the stomach, until we are at the distance that there is from the surface of the bridge to the water, after which it will remain without movement. And if having stopped a little in this space we wish to take a step beyond it, the rod will again take its movement for a little time, and this movement will take place as over its width, that is to say, it will turn in lowering itself towards the karth, and if one wishes afterwards to find the exactness of this trial, one has only to take a string, and, after having measured from the surface of the bridge to the water, he will find the same distance from the extremity of the bridge to the first place, where the movement ceased. This demonstration ought to serve for all hidden things. There is, however, this observation to make with regard to sources, that one cannot descend their depth as exactly as we have just remarked, inasmuch as the water which passes under a bridge is compressed and limited by the extremities of the arch, but that of springs, besides its ordinary canal, penetrates and moistens also a part of the earth which is at its borders, unless it is in a rock, so that to avoid deceiving oneself in this case, we must always augment the distance of the peg by a foot or a foot and a half at the most, according to the size, for more surety. We also make the same augmentation with regard to mines and other hidden things, not only because one never walks so exactly that we cannot miss the space either in advancing too much or too little, the foot or the rest of the body, or also, according as the air is fine or thick, the particles of the body which cause this movement may extend or remain compressed in their limits. These can, in expanding, give a false movement to the rod before one is over the width, and without a great experience they cause as to miss the true place, and, consequently, that of the depth, which one only draws, calculates upon the extremities of the width, and as this error cannot be considerable, because these particles do not extend very far, it is what has caused us to say that to avoid deceiving oneself we must at the most add a foot or a foot and a half. We have seen in the preceding chapter, when we have spoken of those to whom the rod turos in approaching the hidden thing, a sign that the parts which exhale from the bodies disperse themselves from their true satushtin. Thus I shall not enlarge to enforce the necessity. D2. Of this augmentation of a foot or a foot and a half according to the places one has to dig. We must also remark that the knowledge of the depth may be interrupted by some mine, some vein, some spring, or some branch which is to be found in the distance which ought to mark it. To enlighten ourselves, we must make the experiment on another side. For example, if after the spring or mine which has been found, he has walked for the depth and been interrupted on the side the sun rose, he must retrace his steps, cross the width on the side of its setting, mark the extremity with a peg, and from this place walk slowly until the immobility of the rod causes him to know the depth, and that it is confirmed by his return to the width without any interruption. If we find any again on this side, ns it may be only branches of the same spring, or veins of the same inin which are separated. If the place permit it, we must follow one of them going up until we have found the source or trunk, or these two veins, or these two branches united. We can, without obstacle, find the true depth in the manner as above, but if the place does not permit us to follow these branches, as apparently they are of the same depth, we can only find it by planting the first peg at the extremity of the width of the one of those which are at the extremities, and the second at the place where the rod's movement senses, and afterwards do the same with that which is at the other extremity. If the two distances of depth are found equal, we must conclude that this equality is the true sign of it. But if there is some disproportion beyond a foot, it can only be caused by some other spring or by some other branch in the intermediate space, and this it is needful to know in order to gather all the branches. Otherwise, as it often happens, we may take only one bench and leave the N and deeper source, and so make useless the measures already taken to make it lallow the incline, which the branch might have. This is the only means to know the depth in places where the knowledge of it is interrupted by branches of the surrey, or by veins of a mine, that if this interruption comes from some other hidden thing, such as metal, boundary, and sea, you must measure higher or lower from the space which enclosed it, and, by thus doing, be able to find the depth. In a word, in order to well assure oneself of the depth of a source or mine, one must necessarily repass 4 times its width, that is, once on each side of the source, on the cross and going away from it, and another time also on each side on the cross and approaching it, in order to discover if some other branch or some other hidden thing does not interrupt the discovery of the depth. It must also be observed, with regard to the depth of mines, that according as the veins or threads are in a straight line, or follow the veins of the earth, or the clefts of the rock which are peculiar to them, it is much less in certain places than in others. For example, a mine whose trunk may be in a mountain, and whose veins go in a straight line, will be much less deep in the 2 inclines of the mountain than on the top, and, on the contrary, illy, which follows the veins of the earth, or the clefts of the rock, will be much less deep in the summit than at the 2 extremities of the mountain, according to the disposition, place of the said veins. What one ought also carefully to observe is following the thread, in order by this means to discover the other branches in the event of there being any, and to avoid excessive expense by digging in places thought the most convenient, and where one will find it more largely and more abundant. As to the depth of metals and of other hidden things, it suffices to find the space they occupy, as there is neither thread nor vein to follow. As soon as one has found the place of the movement of the rod, one can verify it by 4 different places, that is, from the 2 extremities of the length, and from the 2 of the width, and after having placed a peg at each of these 4 places, one ought to double each when the contrary movement ceases. And if they are all found in the space which ought to mark the depth nearly at an equal distance, one may be assured to a foot, or about 1.5 feet, that the hidden thing is in this same distance of depth. If there are many hidden things in the earth in this same space, but some deeper than others, take the distance of the depth the most distant, because in digging they will be found successively one after the other. Otherwise, one would cease to dig at once at the first kind one might find, thinking there was no more of it, and one might leave the other kinds under or deeper. The rules one have given are certain, and if anyone will dig in a place where he believes he has found something, to enlighten himself about it he can, before digging, hide some metals, or some other thing of the kind, under an arch, in 2 different places, and, after making the trial himself or by someone else, he will see that he can distinguish the kinds by observing all I have said, the length and the width they occupy, as well as the depth, but he must take care that in these arches, or under them, there is no iron or other metal affixed, because one well sees that would interrupt his trial, unless he touched the rod with iron or the other metal. Chapter 9. If one can truly know the size of sources or of mines, almost all those who attempt to tam the rod, and who believe they have some knowledge of its movement, think to discover nearly the size of a source, or that of a mine by the rapidity, or by the slowness of its movement. They think that in the place where it is the quickest and where it forces the most, the source or the mine is there more abundant, and that when it is nearly imperceptible. It is a sign of their smallness and of their sterility. These rules are certain, but they are not conclusive. I mean, they are not sufficient. To discover exactly the quantity of a source or of a mine, I allow that there are places where the movement is slower than in others, that there are others where the rod turns in spite of the resistance which we can make to it by tightening it in order to stop it, and that there are others where one can easily stop it, provided one holds it tighter than usual, but that can never serve so as to make known the true quantity of the hidden thing. We can easily judge by the eye, by the knowledge of the land, which may be in a rocky or marshy place, that the source will be more or less abundant, but that serves less to indicate to us the true quantity than a difference of the most or least according as this movement is more or less rapid. In a word, all that one can judge of is that there is a certain measure or quantity of material towards which the movement is always slow, and that beyond this measure there is another which renders it everywhere equally rapid, but that demonstrates nothing for the quantity, inasmuch that as soon as the movement attains its rapidity, we know less its quantity than its violence, the same as when it is slow, we know less its measure than its slowness. All that can strengthen this opinion is that the matter being in small quantity can only produce few subtle particles, that these few parts can never produce so great an impression as when many are exhaled from an abundant matter. We may judge, then, of the force of this impression by the relation of one to the other, but we can never judge of the most or least of the lightness, nor either of the capacity, because these subtle parts being as it were imperceptible to one's senses, we can never exactly know the degree of the impression which they give. This knowledge is reserved for him alone who is the master of the bodies and of the spirits. For example, if we pass over a source of the size of a finger or of an inch and a half, we shall feel a slow movement, not only by the few essences, spirits, which may be in such a little space, but also by the contrariety which is made in the movement of the width with that of the depth. As the passage from the one to the other is imperceptible, the first of the two movements is so also, and is stopped in some degree by the last, where the rod finds it before one has scarcely remarked the first. But if we pass over a source as large as the leg or the arm, there is space enough to perceive the movement of the size without its being confounded with that of the depth, and we have trouble to arrest the rod's movement. The same as if we pass over a river or a stream, one can make the trial of it. We make the trial of it in passing over the bridge of a river which can be navigated, or over that of an aqueduct or of a stream that turns a windmill, and we shall find everywhere an equally rapid movement. A demonstration may also be made which proves that one does not know exactly the quantity of metals if, for example, one hides 5 louis d'or in one place and 15 in another. When the rod is carried over each of these places, it will force equally without our being able to stop it, although the matter on one side exceeds by 3 times that of the other, which induces me to conclude that one can never know exactly the degree or the quantity of the hidden things, as also that of the impression which our minds have received, and that at the moment the rod has attained a degree of violence, over a source or over a metal, we know less the quantity of this than the violence of that, as also at the moment it has attained one of slowness, we know rather its slowness than the measure or size of the thing which causes it. Chapter N. Of the method of discovering boundaries, roads, or paths is not without reason that the pagans, who made for themselves gods according to their necessities, chose one for limits whom they called the god Termis. There seems something so divine in their formation and in their preservation. The manner of discovering them is so surprising that it seems at first the human mind wants strength to raise itself to the penetration of the causes which can produce such extraordinary effects. In fact, who could believe it, if daily experience did not teach it to us, that the rod comes over limits the same as over sources and over metals, and that a space which of itself could not give any impression, since by the hand or by man's distinction it has changed place, and been made in order to separate, or bound the estates of two individuals, the very stone seems to animate itself, as well as the space which it occupies in length, and acquires by this destination or planting, forming, a virtue and a quality which it had not before. Yet that is certain, and whilst waiting to relate in any other place the natural reason, we will establish here, according as experience has taught it to us, the rules, which we ought to hold in order to discover hidden limits, their depths, and the place where they ought to be, when they have been transplanted by the fraud of the proprietors. The first Nile that must be observed for the discovery of limits is that in holding the rod couché, lying, or half couché, it turns at the moment that we are over the limit, and over the space between two limits, which serve as separation from one limit to the other, when even there shall be no trace to mark it. But it must be observed that the movement which takes place over the limit, or over the width of the separation, is different from that given over the length. Over the limit, or over the width, it turns always in lowering, and over the length always in going up towards the stomach, as if one were following a spring, or a vein of a mine. The second is that the rod tums as well over the visible as over the hidden limit, and not only over the place where it is, but also in that where it ought to be, in the event of its having been transplanted, as well as in all the space that it ought to occupy in length, which indicates and serves to recognize the true place of the separation, when the limit has been changed without the common consent of the proprietors. The third is that, as metal stops the movement for metal, wet rag for water, and sea, so also part of a limit, whether that of the one we sec or of another, provided it is that of a real limit, or a little of the earth, land, which may be in the space of the length of the limits, stops the movement for limits if you touch them with the rod. So that at the moment that the rod turns in any place, if water, metals, and the other kinds cannot stop its movement, you must touch it with the earth, or the stone of a limit, and if it stops, conclude with certainty that there is a limit in this space, and when you have discovered it, you can take away the piece of stone, or of earth, and follow without hindrance the length or the separation, which the limit makes, by the movement which the rod will give in mounting towards the stomach, and find the place of its true sinuation, by that it will give in lowering towards the earth. But not to misunderstand the changes in the causes of the movement, we must take the precaution to touch the rod with the other kinds, for fear lest in finding someone, as there may be in the space of the limit, it may cause us to make a deceptive experience, when in order. To know it, we would try if the stone or earth from the limit stops the movement, and as there are more springs than other things in the ground, we must consequently take with us a wet rag to put at the end of the rod, lest the water should continue the movement which the boundary earth would stop. The same as you must take with you stone or boundary earth when you seek for a spring or a mine along the boundary, lest the limit continue the movement that the water or the metal would stop. There is a fourth maxim which is curious. In order to discover exactly the separation of the two properties, it is that the rod never turns but over the true limit or over the true separation. Thus, when the place of the limit has been discovered by the want of movement, the rod, by touching it with a boundary stone or earth, will show if the limit is in its natural place or if it has been changed. Inasmuch as if it is truly in the place where the agreement of the parties have placed it, the rod will turn in lowering over the limit, and afterwards it will turn in ascending during all the space of the length as far as the other limit. But if it is not in its place, it will turn in lowering over the limit, and will be without movement during all the space of the false length, until the other limit, though there is even a trace between them. And when it passes over the true length, that is to say, over the place which ought to make the true separation, by the first fixing of limits, and by the agreement of the parties, it will tom in lowering when we traverse this length, and in rising towards the stomach when we follow it, and one can only stop it by touching it with the earth of this place, or with a boundary stone. This which marks exactly for us the true place of the limit or separation, better than an indifferent stone, or earth which is 2 or 3 feet from it, or from that of the false separation, as they could not arrest the movement, like a stone of the limit or earth of the place. One may make proof of these truths over known limits, and, as we have said above, that not only the earth or a piece of stone of the limit we seek stops the movement, but also a piece of a true limit of any place whatever. We can also use this trial over visible boundaries in order to distinguish the true from the false. As over the first, the rod turns and its movement cannot be stopped, except by touching it with a stone or earth of the limit. But over the false, it never turns whether it touches these things or not, which ought, by the way, to make us admire the divine providence and the goodness of the God of peace, who by an incomprehensible wisdom has impressed even upon the least things in nature the marks of the principal eulogium which he bears, and such certain signs to preserve it amongst men, that it is not in their power to change a limit without its being known, as we have said above. And as their precautions are so useless against what has been so justly established, if one of them, knowing that the rod tums over a true boundary stone, of whatever kind it may be, had taken one from some place in order to transplant it to the place he desired to usurp, his cheating would be known, inasmuch as the rod would truly give movement over this limit, but it would not give it over the separation, or over the length it ought to mark from one boundary to the other. What we have just said is more than sufficient to teach us to find limits, and one can add nothing to it, unless it is that when they are covered, their depth discovers itself in the same way as that of sources and of mines, and that after having traversed the width of the limits, the contrary movement of the rod ceases at the distance of their depth, the same as with that of sources and of mines. The same providence which has given the means to know limits in order to preserve peace amongst men, has also given to us that of knowing the roads, ways, which serve for their communication and society by the same rules. I mean to say that the rod turns in lowering when one traverses them, whether they be great roads or paths, and by rising when we follow their length, and in the same way we can only stop it by causing it to touch a little of the earth of the same road, which ought to be exactly observed in order not to deceive ourselves when we seek some source, mine or metal, in a road, as if the water or the metal or the other kinds do not stop the rod, we must make it touch a little of the earth of the road to know if it is not this which causes the continuation of the movement. Chapter 11. Of the different causes of the rod's movement. The movement of the rod is so extraordinary and surprising that one must not be astonished if people reason differently upon the causes which may produce it. Some attribute it to sympathy, and without teaching us what that is, they explain one difficulty by another still greater, and rather plunge us into than extricate us from our embarrassment. Others treat it as a chimera, and against what experience is continually teaching us, they say that it is false, and that it consists less in a natural action than in a suppleness or dexterity of hands. There are others also who, wanting rather penetration than knowledge in physical and natural causes, attribute it to sorcery, to Satan, or to the spirits of the air, all which is beyond their understanding, and, without, considering that it is not a less sin to accuse the work of the great architect of imperfection, than to have recourse without necessity to spiritual intelligences in order to supply, aid, these pretended imperfections. They have recourse to spirits, though they themselves forbid access to them, and as the knowledge of them is still more difficult than of that which they neglect to know, they can without trouble attribute to them all the functions of which they stand in need to support their opinion, and by favor of the different operations which they attribute to them, withdraw themselves from the embarrassment into which their negligence has put them. Upon this principle they say, first, that this movement is supernatural, and, without examining, that it is always equal, that its effect does not vary, and that lodestone not better attracts iron. Heavy things tend not less to fall, nor the lighter ones to ascend, than that the rod turns when one is over a spring or a mine. They boldly sustain that the devil has to do with it, and although he is the most unhappy of all creatures, they do him the honor to attribute to him an effect which is only the work of divinity. Besides, there is no one who does not agree that the operations of spirits dependent upon a changeable will are inconstant and subject to change like it, and as they act rather by caprice than by necessity, their operations are always diverse, which one never finds in those of nature. Lodestone has always attracted iron, fire has always tended upwards, earth has always fallen downwards, and the rod has always tamed when it has been carried over matter proper to cause its movement. I maintain, therefore, that there is nothing in the movement of the rod that physical causes cannot attain or explain, and if one will penetrate them without prejudice or a preformed opinion, without seeing its consequences, or without sheltering oneself under favor of a little knowledge of supernatural causes, we shall discover three things. The first, that if this movement were caused by the spirits of the air, it could only be by virtue of an expressed or tacit agreement. This rod turns with children, with persons so pious that one could not, without crime, accuse them with an agreement with the devil. One can less accuse them of a tacit one, because in renouncing it with all their heart, as if needful they would no doubt do, it would remain without effect, and the movement of the rod would cease, which it never does whether they renounce or not. The second is, that if the devil had to do with it, the rod would turn with every one, for there would be no reason to cause him to prefer some to others, and yet we see that there is more than the half, perhaps 3/4, with whom it does not produce this effect. The third thing they will discover is, that there is nothing imperfect in nature, that all bodies have means or natural signs which cause them to be known inwardly. The leaf and the bark of the tree are the marks of its species, the flower is that of the fruit it ought to bear, and the branches and the trunk are those of the roots, which are hidden. All these different things being borne to the exterior senses of men by the kinds which emanate from them, subordinately serve to make him distinguish them, the same as the impression that the interior senses receive for hidden things serves to make him know them by the movement of the rod. These two kinds of knowledge have not a more supernatural sensation the one than the other. And, unless by attributing still to the spirits of the air that which we have of plants and of other bodies of nature, one cannot give them the direction of that which we receive from the movement of the rod. To make this truth plain, one must lay down some rules which in good philosophy will not be contested. The first is, that there emanates or exhales generally from all bodies some subtle particles, which with good reason might be called spirits if they did not come from matter. Corporeal would not need sustenance for their individual support, if it were not necessary for them to avoid their total ruin by repairing the breaches made by this continual emanation. Without these particles, the vapors or exhalations could not be formed. The mirror would reflect no species of things. The light would not communicate itself to our eyes. The odor of flowers would not convey itself to our sense of smell. The dog would not discover the scent of the game, the trace of his master, or would not choose a stone which he had thrown into a heap from others or into the water. In fine, it is only by these particles that plants draw their nourishment, that amber attracts straw, lodestone iron, and that we distinguish the kind from which they emanate, and it would be purposeless to inquire why they do not attract all kinds like the lodestone, and see, for some having more activity than others, according to the ruling or composed matter from which they emanate, they find themselves consequently more or less active. Lodestone, for instance, or straw, would have more air or more fire, which causes a great activity in their particles. So with the rest, the second rule we must observe is that these subtle particles reside and fly about perpetually in the air, around the matter from which they are emanated, and according to its superficies, like a smoke which whirls over a fire or a fog over water, so that though agitated by a slight movement, they are in a perpetual repose in this place, the same as the parts of a running water which are in its bed, or of a fire which is not agitated by a wind, or by some other bodies are said to be in repose. The third, that this repose is never disturbed except by the interjection of another body, which, mixing itself with them, receives the communication of their kind by the agitation or by the impression which they give to it in joining themselves to it. It is thus that those who go upon water feel the damp, and in some way become damp by the particles of water which surround them. It is thus, also, that he who walks in a dry, barren place, filled with sulfur or with some other mineral, will feel the sulfur, bitumen, or any other burnt thing by the touch, or by the junction of the subtle particles which exhale from these bodies. In fine, it is thus that our hair stands on end, and that we have a horror when we pass through a place where a man has been killed, or where his corpse has been buried. In the fourth place, we must remark that of the agitations which happen to these particles, some are ordinary by the simple interposition of the bodies, the others extraordinary, which proceed from the separation of these particles from their common matrix, or from the matter from which they emanated. The first of these agitations is light, and produces only the simple feeling. The second is violent, and is much more sensible. Fire never acts with more violence than when in blowing it you separate it from its aliment. A torrent is never more impetuous, nor more rapid than when barriers are opposed to its passage. Heavy things never tend more violently downwards than when they are the most raised, nor light ones upwards than when they are the lowest. In the same way, these particles never tend more to their E2 center or to unite themselves to their common matrix than when they are the most separated from it, and their impression is never more violent than when they concentrate themselves to return to it. From all these rules we gather a fifth. It is that the sensation or the distinction which we make of the kinds is only made by the impression which the blood receives from these particles, or by the rapport which those which emanate from us make to it from the mixture, which they have made with those of other kinds. And thus, how these foreign particles touching those which emanate from us, and repulsing them, impress them with their movement, and, joining themselves to them, carry away their distinction from our imagination by the difference which it finds in their movement. It is then certain that it is by the movement of these subtle bodies, and by the impression which their touch gives to those which emanate from us, that the sensation or the distinction of kinds is made, that the imagination recognizes them according to the manner by which it is struck by these particles, and to give it the knowledge of them it is requisite necessarily that the communication or touch of two opposite bodies gives or impresses on it a specific movement. There is no one who does not allow that these rules are natural. One may believe Thurn without begging the assistance of spiritual intelligences to perform these operations. One will believe thus that it is in this manner one knows the species of a tree by the subtle particles of the flower, the leaf and the bark, and that we judge that its roots are hidden by the branches and the trunk which are over, and, in fine, that there is something hidden in the earth by the impression given by the particles which are over it. This is how I prove it, when we walk in some place where there is something hidden. The impression which our subtle parts receive from those which occupy the space of the surface of the mines, sources, metals, and sea, obliges those which have emanated from our bodies to enter our blood tumultuously, to give of them, according to custom, the rapport to the imagination by the difference of the movement. Why should it not be that in proportion as these particles enter tumultuously into the body of the man, in order to mark their impression to him, they should cause to go out from him others of which they take the place, which insinuating themselves by the pores into the rod, communicate to it the movement which they have just received. This is the true cause of the movement. It is from the shock or from this impression, which lasts as long as one occupies the space of these heterogeneous bodies, that the turning of the rod comes. And one may boldly assert that as the quickening or the lowering of the pulse marks the different passions by which our blood is affected, the movement of the rod is like a second pulse which marks the agitation our minds have received by the shock of foreign substances. And if we see that, taken through generally, certain maladies are having drunk from the same glass, or by the simple touch, the furies of a mad animal by its saliva or by its bite, that love as well as disease of the eyes by a fixed look, and that there are even animals and certain persons who infect certain objects by their looks, why should it not be that by a man's touch of the rod he should communicate to it the impression that his blood has just received from the shock caused by the particles of the hidden thing? I shall doubtless be asked two things. From whence comes it that these particles which enter into the body, and which give the movement to the rod, do not make themselves known to the imagination, when the species is hidden, the same as when it is apparent, for example, why the kinds of hidden gold do not make it known to our imagination, by the difference of their movement, the same as when it is discovered. The knot of this objection resolves itself by the principles we have placed above, inasmuch as when the kind is apparent, it strikes the exterior sense with an ordinary movement, a natural one, which makes, according to its custom, the rapport to the interior sense, which knows it by this rapport. But when the kind is hidden, as the particles which emanate from it no longer strike the exterior senses, and only give an ordinary movement to the interior, or contrary to the natural, it follows that they can no longer, by this movement, carry the distinction of the kinds which produces them, as, for example, supposing the ordinary movement was high or oblique, the extraordinary would be low or towards the hidden thing to which these particles tend to reunite themselves. This contrariety of movement prevents it producing the same effect. In a word, when the kind is apparent, the subtle particles which emanate from it having only their ordinary movement, the imagination can easily distinguish them by the rapport of the exterior senses which is struck by it. But when it is hidden, the movement of these particles being changed by the interjection of the body which covers them, and from the ordinary become extraordinary, or, contrary to the natural, it no longer affects the exterior sense. And if it affects the interior, it is a movement which is unknown to it, as proceeding from a strange sound of which it does not understand the language. The second objection which will be made to me will be, why this impression does not produce the same effect on all men, or why the rod does not turn to everyone equally. I reply to that in the same way there are lands naturally sterile, and others naturally fertile, according to the different aspects of the sun, or of other planets, healthy and unhealthy air, according as they are filled with particles conformable or contrary to the temperature of the bodies submitted to them, and pure or impure air, according as they are laden or out. Of the sphere of these different particles, so there are bodies which abound in these subtle parts, and others which have scarcely enough of them, besides that there are some which have the more active than others, and which have the pores extremely open, others which have them very closed. Those who are born under certain signs or planets may have these particles so abundant and so active, and the pores so open, that, being repulsed by foreign ones, they must necessarily issue by the pores to make place for those which enter our bodies when we breathe, inasmuch as the vessel being filled neither can remain, and the facility or impetuosity with which they go out communicates or impresses their move, meant to the rod. But those whose pores are closer, or who have not these particles neither so abundant nor active, that others can only enter by obliging those that are there to go out and give them place, cannot impress on the rod the movement they have received, because those outside have not so strong an agitation as those inside, or do not feel it. Here is then the effect the sign or planet produces. It is that it opens the pores of some, and gives them a great abundance of these most active particles, that, on the least impression, they go out to give place to those sent by foreign bodies, and to others where it gives less activity to their subtle parts, or so closes their pores that this transpiration cannot be made. Or if the pores are tortuous, it causes the movement not to be regular, but always in turning upwards towards the stomach or in lowering towards the earth. From thence it is that there are some who have this movement for all hidden things, and others only for some, because if they have the pores very open and straight, this abundance of particles with the required activity, the rod will turn to them without doubt upon all kinds. But if they have only a plenitude of particles with closed pores, there will only be a movement for what gives them the strongest impression, or which accommodates itself the most to their temperament, and thus in proportion as the activity or plenitude is wanting to these particles, or that the pores are more or less closed. I boldly, then, draw this conclusion that, without having recourse to spiritual intelligences, one may hold it as certain that the movement of the rod is physical, that it proceeds only from a physical cause, that is to say, from our particles which emanate from us upon the shock they receive from foreign ones, which communicate to the rod the impression they have received from them. Chapter 12. Explanation of some dues upon the causes. Of the rod's movement, the most palpable truth is always contested, and it is generally in dispute and opposition that it shines, and that it appears with most brilliancy. The principles we have laid down in the preceding chapter are certain, but they are not without some difficulties. We will try to resolve them in this, and to put them as in a new light, by the opposition of contrary reasons. There are few persons who contest the emanation of subtle bodies, and who do not allow that they give some impression to our senses, but they cannot understand how by this impression we can know the space or width of the hidden things, their depth, to distinguish the different kinds, to know the concealed thing, the criminal, or boundaries. And here are the reasons upon which they may conceive it as we ourselves can. I have established as a rule that at the moment one passes over the width of the hidden thing, the rod gives a movement lowering itself. The penetration of the cause is not difficult. The subtle parts which excite this movement being separated from their center or from their common matrix push each other and generally tend towards it to reunite themselves, and being met by those of the man who crosses them in proportion as he enters into the space. 199. They impress upon them the same movement that these communicate afterwards to the rod, and as their movement is downwards or towards the thing concealed, they make it do the same, and give it the same inflection at the end where, or uniting themselves, as it has been said before. They have consequently more strength in this place to mark it. From thence one discovers at the same time the cause of the rapidity or of the slowness of this movement, inasmuch as at the places where there is the most matter causing a great shock and a great escape of these subtle parts, they consequently cause a more rapid movement than when there is very little. A little rivulet has never as much rapidity and impetuosity as a torrent, and one more easily extinguishes a little light than a fire. One ought not then to be astonished if in judging of the place, or of the abundance of a spring, and of that which is only imbibed, because what has been said makes us see how the last ought to give a slower movement than the first. The foundation or rule I have laid down regarding the depth is that it is marked by the movement which the rod gives in mounting against the stomach from the width, until the movement ceases, and that after having ceased, if one advances a step, it gives a contrary movement below. The causes of these effects are nearly similar to those of the preceding, because the subtle particles which produce them being drawn by the body which has traversed them beyond the space which they occupied, they take a movement behind in order to arrive at the place from which they have been drawn, and consequently give the same to the particles of the man, and successively to the rod, which they also cause to turn backwards, that is to say, in ascending towards the stomach. And as these particles cannot act beyond the sphere of their activity, this sphere only extending itself to the distance of the intermediate body, that is to say, for example, the ground which separates them, their movement ceasing in this interval, one knows consequently the distance of the depth. The solution of this difficulty serves also to show us how it happens that these particles give the same movement when one ascends a source or mine, because these subtle bodies, following the bent of that from which they emanate, in which they mix and float perpetually from one extremity to the other, being stopped and agitated by the body which opposes itself to their passage and which crosses them, make a circular movement around it, in order to take their natural bent, like the parts of water or of fire which are stopped by a body. And this is what causes a backward movement, rising against the stomach, as it has been said elsewhere. There still remains a difficulty about the depth. It is how it happens that after the movement which marks its distance has ceased, if one advances still a step, it takes a contrary movement, that is, lowering, and that afterwards, if one retraces one's steps, it gives none at all until one has again entered into the width. This difficulty will cease when one comes to think that the want of movement which happens to the rod at the extremity of the distance of the depth only proceeds from the absence of the subtle particles which caused it, because, having withdrawn themselves, the rod can no longer have the backward movement which it received by their impression. And if in passing beyond by a step the place where this movement has ceased, it comes to give a contrary one, it is not through having received a new impression from particles different to the first which agitated it, but rather because there still remain some, which, not having been able, like the others, to return, cause the rod to turn by the new effort which they make to rejoin them. And as they are no longer drawn behind by the rapidity of their movement, they follow, and cause the rod to follow their ordinary bent, which is to tend downwards. One sees the demonstration of this truth in those who go out of a place full of thick smoke, or in those who go out of water. They draw with them an abundance of smoke, or of water, which follows them for some space. Not always as much as these particles because it is heavier, but at least enough to cause us to comprehend that when the smoke or the water which accompanied the body went out from it has retired into its place or its channel, there always remain some parts or some drops attached to the body, which, not having so well been able to be separated from it as the others, no longer tend towards the mass they have left, but upwards or below, where they go successively according to their bent and natural inclination. And the same that after this water has run off until it has rejoined the mass or the stream, one feels no dampness, because no part of the water remains upon him. The same also when one returns upon the depth after leaving it for a few steps. When one traverses it, the rod gives no movement until begins to enter into the width, because all these particles being entirely withdrawn, they give no impression until they are rejoined in the current, that is to say, in the space which they occupy over the width. As to the distinction of kinds, I have established as a rule that one knows them in this, that at the moment of their touching the rod with substances of the same nature as the hidden thing, its movement is arrested. The cause of this effect is as evident as that of the preceding, because the kind which touches or which appears, attracting or uniting to itself these particles, which, by the total separation from their center or from their common matrix, were in a violent agitation to unite themselves to it, puts them into repose, and causes their agitation to cease by their union to the kind of the same nature that they touch on the rod. It is thus that the magnetic needle, which naturally turns itself towards the side of the North Pole, where the center of attraction is, stops its movement and ceases to turn. The movement, or the extraordinary agitation which these subtle bodies had by their separation from their center being thus stopped, there only remains the natural or ordinary, which by itself, giving no impression, or a very light one, as being in repose, or united to a matter of the same quality as that from which they were separated. One ought not to be astonished that the rod does not turn over water, nor over all the other visible kinds, because the particles of water and sea, being in repose, give no impression to the body which they surround, or only give it one so light that it is imperceptible, as we have said. A proof that these particles give no impression when they are in the place of their repose is that their activity only proceeds from the violence which they feel when they are separated from it. We do not smell the odor of a flower if we do not draw its particles in breathing. Our respiration must draw them with violence to our smell. A dog would not find the scent of game, nor that of his master, if respiration did not draw it, and thus with the rest, so that these particles do not give any sensible impression, if the violence they suffer does not excite them and give them activity. Still, they say, supposing it to be so, how shall one know the place where a stolen thing has been hidden, or the thief, or the criminal? It appears that the difficulty no longer exists for the stolen thing, because, being a body, as well as the other kinds of which we have spoken, it can exhale particles which may give impression or movement to the rod, which one may stop and know the cause of by touching it with things of the same kind if one has them, so that if after having touched it, it continues its movement, one may say the same as with the sources, that this continuation proceeds from another cause, which may by chance be found in the place where one seeks. But that does not suffice to discover if the thing has been stolen or not, because it may be that the rod turns less for the theft than for the thing stolen. Yet, as we are convinced that the rod turns equally over the criminal and over the stolen thing, after having verified for more certainty that there is no foreign cause for its movement, I no longer doubt that the crime affects the thing and the criminal with a particular quality which they had not before, and that the agitation which remorse excites in the particles of the criminal since the crime was committed is redoubled by their union to those of the stolen thing, and that this union, like that which takes place over limits, as we shall afterwards show, makes a composition which perpetuates a uniform movement to the rod in every place where the thief has passed or the stolen thing, and principally in those where either has stopped, so that nothing can stop its movement over either, because when it is touched with similar things, they would not be affected by a similar union or a similar quality of theft. What confirms me in the belief of this union is that the more abundant are the subtle particles of the thing which has given rise to the crime, the more violent is the impression which they give. For example, the union of the particles of the murderer with those of the murdered would give a greater impression than those of the thief with those of the stolen thing, because in the first case there is a greater and more violent exhalation from the particles of the murdered, and as they are stronger, I do not doubt that they follow where those of the murderer, and that the movement which they excite is still stronger for the knowledge of this crime than that which is excited by simple theft. This truth is also proved by the movement which the rod gives to the places where the criminal or the thing affected by the crime are lying, inasmuch as that there is there a greater exhalation of these particles, the rod consequently gives more movement, which causes the place to be easily known. And by this reason one also easily knows the place where the crime has been committed, because as there is there a greater exhalation, the movement is also more rapid. In a word, if, as is said, the rod turns over all criminals, of whatever nature the crime, this movement only proceeds from a similar union, or from that since the crime committed, the subtle particles of the criminals being more than usually agitated, they have taken a movement differing from those of the innocent, which causes that being more violent, it suffices to move the rod of him who seeks. But, as a jury decides that for conviction there should be proofs clearer than the day, I would not at once trust to this, not only because I may fail to touch the rod with some kind which, stopping its movement, would discharge the criminal of the crime laid to him, but also because a man, agitated by an ill-founded fear, or by some imagination in his head, might cause the same movement, the same as a man firm, without remorse and without fear, although the criminal giving no agitation to his spirits could not give any to the rod, which can, however, happen with difficulty, because the said union is always to the last, and is wanting to the first. Yet in a case of crime, one must always lean to the gentlest side. I resolve to say that its movement over a criminal can never serve as a proof for his conviction, but only for some indication or presumption of it. The last difficulty which remains to be examined concerns the movement of the rod over limits. I agree that there are things which appear to surpass physical causes, one finds it difficult to think that a stone, which of itself gives no movement, can give one at the moment where it is employed for limits, and that a space which from its nature gives none, as soon as it is employed to make the separation of some property, begins to enclose in itself animated particles which cause this movement, yet experience shows it us every day, and teaches us at the same time, that besides the will of God, which has disposed all things by its providence in such sort as to keep peace amongst men, this effect is produced in the same way as the preceding over water, minerals, and sea. In a word, it is by the means of the common subtle kinds, fluids, in the body, which are exhaled from the surrounding parts when they planted the limits. No one disallows that in this movement, the two interested parties, or someone for them were there, that these parties having agreed on the space which ought to make the separation, and the place where the limit ought to be planted, would go and return along this separation in order to place the cords and peas and shed in this planting, or in these alleys and knolls, a quantity of those particles or subtle bodies which case the pavement, and that they shed still more in touching the stones which serve as a limit, and that, in proportion as they bury these stones, they bury a quantity of these particles with them. It is these particles of different kinds which make a union, which reproduces continually similar ones to their composition. It is these buried particles or subtle bodies, which by divine permission compose a kind of mass or circle of them, which keep as enchained or attached to them by an invisible chain those which remain in the air all along the path traced by them during the space of the separation. It is these last, which moving and reproducing themselves, perpetually in this space from one limit to another, as to the place of their attachment, give and impress on the rod a movement similar to that which it has over sources and mines. It appears that I see a crowd of opponents who would ask me how it is that these particles are not exhaled by the succession of time, but I answer that that ought not to appear more strange to them than to see the mistletoe of the oak or apple tree, which they pretend grows from the excrement of a bird, produce itself, generate, and remain perpetually upon the matter on which this excrement fell, spite of sun, and wind, and min. Moreover, it is not more surprising to see the particles perpetually remaining over the limits and reproducing themselves than to see, according to what naturalists say, that one of the drops of milk which issues from coral, when broken in the sea, produce there another coral shrub upon whatever it falls, and that this drop, without varying, rests on the place where it falls, produces there a new coral branch, brings it up, and causes it to grow as large or larger as that from which it was produced, spite of the agitation of the waves and the movement of the water, which ought as easily to carry this drop of milk above the stone or place where it falls, impede its generation, and prevent its reproducing itself, as the winds or succession of time can carry away the particles of the surrounding parties, which are sown upon the limit or upon the space of the separation. In fine, one ought no more to be astonished to see these particles fixed upon limits, or upon the space of separation, than at what we remember for 60 or 80 or more years, things that we have seen, felt, tasted, touched, and there are few philosophers who do not agree that this reminiscence is caused by means of particles which, remaining attached to our senses, although the object is no longer there, by recalling the idea of it to our memory every time they represent themselves to our imagination, why not allow the same with particles buried with limits, perpetually remaining there, that they reproduce it, and, being of the same nature as those in the air, in the space of separation, they keep them there attached like a tree, which is upon its root, or by the inclination which they have to unite with their like, and make them remain there, so that they present themselves to the man the same as the intentional kinds to memory. The reason is the same for both. It is certain that these particles, or those which are reproduced by them, remain about these limits, either flying about or running continually from one limit to another, or all along the separation where they are seen. They tend downwards continually towards those which are attached to the limits, which causes a similar movement to the rod when one traverses them, as that which it receives in traversing a source or a mine, and a contrary one when in following the length one opposes their passage. The same as one sees a contrary one when in ascending a source or vein of a mine, one opposes the passage of the particles which are following their best. One will object that if this movement is similar to that made over mines, springs, and sea, why does the rod turn upon the visible stone of limit, and not over water or the matter of the mine? This difficulty can be resolved, but to make it more clear, I shall observe three things. The first, that the particles emanated from surrounding F2 parties, which are enclosed with the limits, are so united in them, that they may be said to be concentrated. The second, that the superficies of the apparent limit, like that of the ground of separation, have no part in this to union, the same as the surface of the man has no part in the kinds which he encloses in himself. The third, that the traces which the parties have made in going and coming along the separation have also concentrated some which are like the stem, or root, or center of those which circulate in the air above this place. This agreed, one easily discovers why the apparent limit or ground of separation cannot arrest the movement of the rod, for being on a surface, which is not like what they enclose of the same nature as the particles in the air, and which have caused the movement, they can neither stop it nor cause it to cease, because they do not stop their agitation in reuniting, and in putting them into the repose they seek, as the spring or apparent mine do owe the subtle bodies of similar natures to themselves. And if in breaking a piece of the boundary stone, or fump of earth from the separation line, they stop the movement, it is that in breaking these pieces, some of those particles which were concentrated are discovered, which by the touch of the rod, uniting the others to them, putting them into the repose they sought, cause their rotation to cease, and consequently arrest the movement at which they caused. This reason serves also to each now. It is that when a limit is changed, the rod does not ta over the phase length, because the subtle particles which were concentrated in the true separadion have not quitted it to follow the limit when it was changed, and it turns always over the true separation, or over the limit where they were concentrated, rather than over the false separation, because none of these concentrated particles, being in this place those which are in the air, are not attracted, as over the true separation, where some always remain concentrated, to which they try to unite themselves. Doubtless the rules I have given about the planting of limits will make some say I have gone beyond those of reason, but I shall be glad if they can contradict me. Without doing so, and until beyond the causes that I attribute to the will and power of God, which are beyond limit, let him give me more natural or apparent causes than mine. I declare that rather than have recourse to the spirits of the air, I shall keep to my first opinion, which, being founded on a physical and real cause, produces always the same effect, which would not be found in the spirits of the air, or by spiritual intelligences, and by this means, instead of taxing with imperfection the work of the Creator, I praise and admire recently the great workman, who, by an operation of which he alone is capable, has shown in the least things the signs of his goodness toward man. Finis.